The clock in Thomas Harper's Des Moines condo ticked past 11:42 p.m., its rhythm cutting through the silence of the dimly lit kitchen. At 54, Thomas sat alone, a forensic accountant whose life was forged in finding truth buried in numbers. His phone glowed with an email from his wife, Sarah Coleman, titled, "We're done, Thomas." His pulse held steady as he opened it. "I'm not coming back," she wrote. "I've found someone who fits my life better. Your things are in storage. Check the PDF for access. I've taken my share from our account. Don't make this messy." Attached was a bank transfer confirmation, $118,000 drained from their joint savings to her personal account. A second file held a photo. Sarah, radiant in a sequined dress, arm in arm with Brandon Tucker at a Palm Springs party. Captioned, "This is the life I deserve." The jab sliced deep, her contempt bare. She thought Thomas, with his spreadsheets and quiet evenings, could never match this glamour. Inside, a storm churned. Betrayal stung, but worse was the weight of 15 years, his love dismissed as worthless. Yet he pushed it down, his mind sharpening like a blade. She thought him weak, a man who'd break. He wouldn't. 15 years of marriage dissolved in a cold email. Thomas sipped his cold coffee, his face hard as steel. Sarah always saw him as predictable, a dull man too absorbed to notice her drifting, the long wellness trips, the new clothes never worn for him, the laughter she saved for others. She didn't know he'd seen it all, or that 5 years ago, he'd quietly built a financial fortress she couldn't breach. He opened a secret email account. 3 alerts flashed. Sarah had tried to access accounts she didn't know existed. She thought she'd outsmarted him. He replied, "Enjoy your freedom." Then he called his brother Michael, the contingency plan. "It's time." Sarah had misjudged the man she mocked. What happens when the underestimated strike back? Thomas Harper carried the weight of 54 years, with a quiet dignity, his salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him the look of a scholar, rather than a man who unraveled financial conspiracies. In his Des Moines office, surrounded by neat stacks of ledgers and a single potted plant, he worked as a forensic accountant, sifting through numbers to expose truths others tried to hide: money laundering, corporate fraud, hidden assets. His mind was a steel trap, catching discrepancies others missed, a skill honed over decades. At home, his condo was sparse: a leather chair, a bookshelf of finance texts, a workbench where he carved wooden shelves on weekends, a craft learned from his father, a carpenter who valued hands as much as heart. Thomas woke at 5:30 every morning, brewed black coffee, and ran 3 miles before dawn, his routine as unyielding as his principles. He didn't drink whiskey or chase thrills. His joy was in order, in the certainty of a balanced ledger. Yet Sarah Coleman, his wife of 15 years, saw only a man chained to monotony. "You're so predictable, Thomas," she'd say, rolling her eyes when he tried to share a case he'd cracked. "All those numbers, God, it's boring." She called him her safe husband, a jab she thought clever, believing he was too absorbed to notice her disdain. Sarah never knew the man who turned down a lucrative New York job to stay in Des Moines when his mother fell ill, or who funded scholarships for local kids through a quiet charity. 5 years ago, sensing a shift in her, Thomas began shielding his wealth: LLCs, trusts, crypto, offshore accounts, all invisible to Sarah. She thought him a fool, but he was a sentinel, watching, waiting. He met Sarah at a University of Iowa alumni event, a 38-year-old divorce rebuilding after a brief first marriage. She was 34, a yoga instructor with a smile that lit rooms and ambitions that outstripped her wallet. Her energy pulled him in, a contrast to his measured world. "I don't care about your job details," she'd laugh when he mentioned work. "Just keep the checks coming, and we're good." He married her within a year, funding her yoga studio, a sprawling house, luxury cars, vacations to places he'd rather not go. His father warned him once, hammer in hand as they fixed a deck, "Sarah doesn't see what you do to earn her lifestyle. Be careful, son." Thomas brushed it off, but the words lingered. Sarah grew distant, her life consumed by Instagram, where thousands followed her fitness posts. Her wellness trips stretched from weekends to weeks, dismissed with a wave. "You'd hate it, Thomas. Just yoga and juice." She forgot his birthday last Christmas, offering a flashy watch as an afterthought, her eyes already elsewhere. "I'm just so busy with the studio," she said, but he saw the truth in her distracted glances. She mocked his work at dinners, joking to friends, "Thomas lives for his calculators," her laughter sharp. He stayed silent, not from weakness, but from hope he could save what they had. Yet her contempt gnawed at him, a wound he buried under routine. Sarah never knew his sacrifices, how he'd skipped promotions to be near family, or how he carried his father's lessons of loyalty. She saw a man she could outmaneuver, blind to the strength beneath his quiet. In the stillness of his Des Moines condo, Thomas Harper sat at the kitchen table, the faint glow of his phone cutting through the darkness. It was 11:42 p.m., Thursday, and the world outside was silent, save for the relentless ticking of the clock. The email from Sarah Coleman, his wife of 15 years, arrived like a blade. "We're done, Thomas." He opened it, his fingers steady, though the words struck with calculated cruelty. "I'm not coming back," she wrote. "I've found someone who fits my life better. Your things are in storage. Check the PDF for access. I've taken my share from our account. Don't make this messy." A PDF confirmed it. $118,000 siphoned from their joint savings to her personal account. Then, a second attachment, a photo of Sarah, dazzling in a sequined dress, clinging to Brandon Tucker at a Palm Springs gala, her smile triumphant. The caption read, "This is the life I deserve." The words were a slap, her contempt laid bare. Thomas, with his quiet routines and endless spreadsheets, was a relic she'd outgrown. Inside he felt the ground shift, a hollow ache where love had been, now filled with the sting of being deemed unworthy. Yet he swallowed it, his resolve like iron. She wouldn't see him break. She thought him too dull to challenge her, a man who'd crumble under her betrayal. He sipped his cold coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. His eyes lingered on the photo, her laughter a silent taunt. 15 years, countless compromises, sacrifices, checks signed without question, gone in a single email. The kitchen's dim light cast shadows on his face, hard as steel, betraying no shock, only clarity. Sarah believed she'd won, that her safe husband was too predictable to fight back. She didn't know the man she'd mocked, the one who'd spent years preparing for a moment like this. He set the phone down, the weight of her misjudgment settling in. The signs had been there, piling up like entries in a ledger Thomas couldn't ignore, though he'd tried. Sarah's wellness trips had grown longer, stretching from weekends to full weeks, always dismissed with a breezy "you'd be bored, Thomas." Just yoga and green juice. Her wardrobe filled with designer athleisure, outfits she never wore at home, reserved for Instagram posts that glowed with a life he wasn't part of. Her phone, once left carelessly on the counter, now locked with a passcode, and she'd slip away for calls, her voice low, her laughter bright in a way it hadn't been for him in years. Once, at a friend's dinner, he'd overheard her joke, "Thomas is my ATM, pays the bills, no questions asked," her friend's laughter stinging more than her words. The memory burned now, a wound reopened. He'd stood in the shadows, her words carving into him, yet he'd stayed silent, hoping she'd see him as more than a means to an end. She thought he hadn't heard, or worse, that he wouldn't care. To Sarah, he was a cog in her machine, too slow to notice her drifting, too absorbed in his numbers to suspect. Each slight had lodged in him, not as anger, but as data points in a pattern he'd refused to name. Now, staring at her email, the pattern was complete, the discrepancy undeniable. He didn't rage or curse. His mind worked like it did on a case, tracing the error to its source. Sarah's contempt had blinded her. She assumed his silence was weakness, his routines a cage. She didn't see the man who'd balanced their life with the same precision he brought to his work, or the one who'd hoped, against reason, that she'd turn back to him. The photo of her with Brandon burned in his mind, a final proof of how little she understood him. Thomas stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and crossed to his laptop. He opened a secret email account, one Sarah didn't know existed, his fingers moving with the calm of routine. 3 alerts waited, attempts to change passwords on accounts she'd never heard of. His LLCs, trusts, offshore holdings. Sarah had been thorough, probing for cracks, but she'd underestimated the fortress he'd built. 5 years ago, a quiet instinct had driven him to protect what was his, a precaution she'd never suspect from her boring husband. He leaned back, the screen's glow illuminating his steady gaze. She thought she'd stripped him bare, but she'd only touched what he'd allowed. He typed a reply to her email, "Enjoy your freedom." The words were simple, final, a door closing. He picked up his phone and called Michael, his younger brother, whose voice crackled with concern. "The contingency plan we talked about," Thomas said, his tone even. "It's time." Michael hesitated. "You sure?" "She made her move," Thomas replied, hanging up. He walked to the living room, pausing at the wedding photo on the wall, Sarah's radiant smile, his own reserved. It was the last trace of them together in the condo, a relic of a life she'd discarded. Sarah had bet against him, believing his silence meant surrender, his love a leash. She didn't know the man who'd spent years watching, waiting, ready to rewrite the story she thought she controlled. He turned off the light, the darkness swallowing the frame, and prepared for what came next. Morning broke over Des Moines. Gray light filtering through the condo's blinds, but Thomas Harper was already awake. The email from Sarah Coleman sat heavy in his mind, her words and that mocking photo, her with Brandon Tucker, captioned, "This is the life I deserve." A wound that didn't bleed but hardened him. He brewed his usual black coffee, the ritual grounding him as he sat at his desk, laptop open. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who'd spent decades untangling lies. He logged into his custom-built financial management system, a tool he designed for clients, but adapted for himself. With a few keystrokes, he froze all joint accounts, canceled their shared credit cards, and triggered a fraud alert on the $118,000 Sarah had siphoned. His contacts at the bank, built over years of professional trust, promised swift action. Sarah thought him a plotting fool, too buried in numbers to fight back, but she'd misread the man she called safe. He emailed his attorney, attaching Sarah's email and the transfer confirmation, with a single instruction: file for divorce, now. Then he drove to the storage unit listed in her PDF, the morning air sharp against his face. The unit held only 2 boxes, clothes, his laptop, nothing of the life they'd built. The absence of his father's watch, a simple steel timepiece engraved with "Keep What Matters," cut deeper than the money. In his mind, he saw Sarah tossing it aside, her smirk as she called it old-fashioned, a symbol of everything she despised about him. He'd loved her once, enough to ignore her scorn, but now that love was ash, replaced by a vow to reclaim what she'd tried to erase. Sarah hadn't just left, she'd tried to erase him. Standing in the cold concrete space, Thomas felt a resolve take root, not anger but a clarity that Sarah had underestimated him for the last time. He closed the unit's door, the lock's click echoing like a vow. Back in his condo, Thomas opened his laptop again, this time accessing restricted financial databases available only to licensed investigators. His forensic accountant's mind went to work, tracing the threads Sarah thought she'd hidden. He started with Brandon Tucker, the man in her photo, whose Instagram painted him as a fitness guru but whose finances told a different story. Within an hour, Thomas uncovered a pattern. Over the past year, Sarah had funneled $80,000 from their joint account to Brandon's gym, Harmon Fitness LLC, in small, steady transfers she'd disguised as studio expenses. The betrayal wasn't new. It had been planned, calculated. He leaned back, the memory of a moment last summer flickering to life. Sarah had picked up his father's watch from the dresser, smirking. "This old thing?" "Thomas, you're so stuck in the past." Her laugh had stung, her dismissal of something sacred a sign of how little she valued him. Now, as he traced her transactions, he saw her contempt in every digit, a deliberate plan to use his trust against him. Why had he stayed silent so long, hoping she'd see him? The guilt gnawed, but he pushed it aside. She'd chosen this, not him. She saw his silence as weakness, his routines as chains, never suspecting he'd noticed her late-night texts, or the way she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring at events. Now, staring at the transaction logs, he saw the full scope of her contempt. She'd used his money to build a new life, believing he'd never look close enough to see. The realization hit like a physical weight, not just the loss of funds, but the erasure of 15 years, the life he'd thought they shared. Yet as the numbers glared back, Thomas felt no urge to shout or break. His father's voice echoed, "Keep what matters." The watch was gone, but his resolve wasn't. He would reclaim what Sarah thought she'd stolen, piece by meticulous piece. Thomas called his brother Michael, whose expertise in digital security complemented his own skills. "I need everything on Harmon Fitness LLC," he said, his voice low but firm. Michael didn't pry, only asked, "Legal channels, right?" "Just connecting public dots," Thomas replied, a faint edge in his tone. By noon, Michael sent an encrypted file. Brandon's gym was a house of cards, maxed out credit cards, a lease he couldn't afford, and a $175,000 equipment loan Sarah had co-signed, using their marital assets as collateral. Worse, she'd forged Thomas's signature to secure it, a reckless move that assumed he'd never dig deep enough to find out. Sarah's arrogance stunned him, not just her betrayal but her certainty that he was too dull to notice. Another call came, this time from Valerie, his assistant at the firm. I wasn't sure if I should say, she began, hesitant. But Sarah took papers from your desk last month. I kept copies. She emailed scans of a loan document, the forged signature glaringly obvious. Valerie, quiet and unassuming, had seen what Sarah hadn't. Thomas wasn't a man to underestimate. He thanked her, his voice steady but grateful. The documents confirmed what he'd feared. Sarah hadn't just left him for Brandon. She'd entangled their finances in his failing empire, betting Thomas would stay oblivious. A memory surfaced. Sarah at a party, laughing with friends. Thomas is too busy counting pennies to care what I do. Her words had been a knife, but he'd swallowed the pain, hoping she'd see him one day. Now, he saw her clearly, a woman who thought she could rewrite his life without consequence. The weight of the day settled as Thomas sat back, the condo's silence pressing in. He thought of their mutual friends, how none had called to check on him, as if Sarah's charm had erased his worth. Their silence stung, a reminder of how thoroughly she'd diminished him in their eyes. He opened a drawer, pulling out a photo of his father, taken at the Minnesota cabin where they'd fished together. "Don't let anyone take what's yours, son," his father had said, his hands rough from years of work. Thomas had promised to honor that, a vow now tested. The missing watch wasn't just a trinket, it was a tether to that promise, to the man who'd taught him to stand firm. Sarah's betrayal wasn't a single act but a campaign, years in the making, funded by his trust. She'd planned her exit, her new life with Brandon, all while smiling at him across the dinner table. The scope of it, $80,000, forged signatures, stolen heirlooms, should have broken him, but it didn't. Each discovery was a piece of a puzzle he'd been too hopeful to solve, a ledger of deceit he now balanced with cold precision. Sarah thought she knew him, thought him a man who'd bend under her will. She didn't know the Thomas who'd spent years preparing, who'd learned from his father to guard what mattered most. Yet, as he closed the photo drawer, a flicker of doubt surfaced. Had he waited too long, let her drift too far? He pushed it down, focusing on the fight ahead. He closed the laptop, his resolve like iron. The trap she'd set was closing, but not around him. Thomas Harper sat across from his attorney, Ellen Carver, in her sleek Des Moines office, the morning sun glinting off the glass desk between them. He slid a folder across, its contents a damning ledger of Sarah Coleman's betrayal, the email announcing her departure, the $118,000 transfer from their joint account, the forged signature on a $175,000 loan for Brandon Tucker's gym, and scanned documents from Valerie proving Sarah's theft of papers from his desk. Ellen skimmed the pages, her eyebrows lifting. "She thought you wouldn't notice," she said, half question, half statement. Thomas nodded, his voice steady. "She thought I was too busy counting pennies to care." Sarah's contempt had been her blind spot, her belief that her safe husband lacked the will to fight. He leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "I want every shared asset frozen," the fraud reported, "and the divorce filed today. She doesn't touch what's mine again." Ellen nodded, already drafting motions. Thomas's calm wasn't resignation, it was the precision of a man who'd spent decades unraveling lies. Sarah had mocked his work, called his meticulousness boring, never imagining it would be her undoing. He'd built a financial fortress, LLCs, trusts, crypto, offshore accounts, knowing one day her ambition might turn against him. As he left the office, the city hummed around him, oblivious to the war he'd just begun. Sarah had bet on his passivity, assuming he'd crumble under her sudden exit. She didn't know the man who'd turned down promotions to care for his dying mother, or who'd learned from his father to guard what mattered. The folder on Ellen's desk was his first move, a quiet declaration that Sarah's game was over. He drove back to his condo, his mind already mapping the next steps. In his condo, Thomas opened his laptop, the screen's glow a stark contrast to the gray afternoon outside. He called Michael, his brother, whose voice crackled through the speaker. "I need more on Brandon Tucker's finances," Thomas said, his tone clipped. Michael, a digital security expert, had already pulled public records, but now they went deeper. "You're not going to like this," Michael warned, sending a file. 3 years ago, Thomas had introduced Brandon to an investor to save his struggling gym, a favor born of Sarah's insistence that he's got potential. Now Brandon was her accomplice, his gym propped up by $80,000 of Thomas's money, siphoned by Sarah. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected, a sharp pang of foolishness for trusting Sarah's judgment. He'd helped Brandon, only to be repaid with deceit. Michael uncovered more. Brandon's LLC was drowning in debt. 3 maxed-out credit cards, a car lease Sarah co-signed, and the $175,000 loan with Thomas's forged signature. Sarah had bet their marriage on a sinking ship, believing Thomas too slow to notice. "She thought you were just her bank," Michael said, disgust in his voice. Thomas stared at the numbers, a memory surfacing, Sarah at a gala, whispering to Brandon while Thomas stood alone, her glance dismissing him as irrelevant. She'd called him predictable to his face, thinking he'd never challenge her. But Thomas was a forensic accountant, trained to see what others hid. Every transfer, every lie was a thread he'd pull until her web unraveled. Michael's file was ammunition, proof of a betrayal deeper than infidelity. Sarah hadn't just left, she'd exploited the trust Thomas had given, assuming his love made him blind. He wasn't blind. He'd been patient, and now that patience was a weapon. He thanked Michael, his resolve sharpening like a blade. Thomas turned to strategy, his mind a chessboard where Sarah and Brandon were already outmaneuvered. He crafted an email from a fake investor, sent to Brandon's business account, proposing a meeting to discuss significant funding for Harmon Fitness. The bait was simple but effective. Brandon's ego and desperation would keep him distracted, chasing a mirage while Thomas dismantled his world. Next, he set alerts on all shared assets, ensuring Sarah couldn't mortgage their home or open new credit lines. He hired a private investigator to track down his father's watch, the one Sarah had scoffed at, its absence a wound he refused to let fester. Then Valerie called, her voice tentative but firm. "I kept a log," she said, emailing a detailed record of Sarah's visits to Thomas's office, dates, times, documents taken. "She thought I was just the receptionist," Valerie added, a hint of defiance. Thomas's lips twitched, the closest he came to a smile. Valerie, overlooked like him, had seen Sarah's arrogance and chosen loyalty. Her log was a goldmine, linking Sarah's theft to the forged loan. Sarah had underestimated his allies, believing her charm could eclipse his quiet strength. She didn't know the network he'd built, the people who respected the man she mocked. Each move, fake email, asset alerts, investigator, Valerie's log, was a brick in the wall he was raising around Sarah's plans. He leaned back, the condo silent but for the hum of his laptop. Sarah thought she'd rewritten his story, but he was the one holding the pen, and her ending wasn't the one she'd imagined. Thomas drove to Harmon Fitness, the gym's neon sign blazing against the evening sky. Inside, sleek machines and motivational posters screamed success. But Thomas knew the truth. It was a facade built on his money. Brandon spotted him, his tanned face breaking into a practiced smile, hand extended. "You must be Thomas," he said, voice smooth. "Sarah's mentioned you." Thomas ignored the handshake, placing a folder on Brandon's glass desk. "Every loan Sarah co-signed for you, using our marital assets," he said, his voice low, cutting. "The banks approved them based on my income. Those guarantees are void now." Brandon's smile faltered, his fingers flipping through the pages. Credit card debts, the car lease, the $175,000 loan with Thomas's forged signature. "Sarah said you were loaded," Brandon said, trying to recover. "Just a guy who works too much, no fight in you." The echo of Sarah's contempt stung, her voice in Brandon's words. Inside, Thomas felt a flicker of betrayal, not just Sarah's, but Brandon's, a man he'd once helped. He'd given Brandon a chance, only to be mocked as spineless. But he buried the hurt, his eyes like flint. She'd painted Thomas as a pushover, a man too buried in numbers to challenge her new life. "She didn't know me," Thomas replied. "The banks will call those loans soon. I'd prepare." He paused, adding, "And I want my father's watch back. You'll know it." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Thomas left, the gym's noise fading behind him. Sarah had fed Brandon her lies, convinced he'd never face the man she'd dismissed. But Thomas wasn't just fighting for money. He was reclaiming the life she thought she could steal, and Brandon was about to learn the cost of her misjudgment. Back at the condo, Thomas's phone lit up with Sarah's name. 10 missed calls, then a text, "What did you do?" "The accounts are frozen, my cards don't work." Her panic was palpable, her next message sharper. "You can't do this to me, Thomas. I'll fight you." He didn't reply, the silence his answer. A memory clawed its way up. A dinner party last year, Sarah laughing with friends, calling him my ATM as if he were a punchline. He'd stood in the kitchen, unnoticed, her words slicing deeper than she'd ever know. She thought him spineless, a man who'd bend to her will forever. Now, as her texts piled up, Thomas felt no urge to engage. His plan was in motion, the lawyer's motions, Michael's data, Valerie's log, the investigator's search, the trap for Brandon. Each piece locked into place, a machine he'd built in silence. while Sarah danced in her delusion. She'd underestimated his mind, his allies, his will. He opened his laptop, checking the alerts. Sarah had tried accessing their frozen account again, her desperation a confirmation of his control. He closed the screen, the condo's quiet wrapping around him. Sarah and Brandon thought they'd rewritten his story, but Thomas was no victim. He was a man who'd spent years preparing, whose love had been a choice, not a chain. The trap was closing, and they'd never see it coming. He poured a fresh coffee, the steam rising like a promise, and turned his mind to the final moves. 3 weeks after Sarah Coleman's email shattered his world, Thomas Harper sat in his condo, the morning light casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed with a call from Ellen Carver, his attorney, her voice crisp with news. "The bank's investigation is complete," she said. "Sarah forged your signature on the $175,000 loan for Brandon Tucker's gym, and they've flagged the $118,000 transfer as fraud. They're preparing to refer it to the district attorney." Thomas listened, his face hard as steel, the weight of her words settling like a ledger balanced at last. Ellen continued, "We're ready for mediation tomorrow. I've compiled everything, her email, the transfer, Valerie's documents, the forged loan papers." Thomas nodded, though she couldn't see, his mind already sifting through the evidence. Sarah had thought him a pushover, a man too buried in numbers to fight her calculated exit. She'd mocked his meticulousness, called him predictable to friends, never imagining he'd turn her own moves against her. He opened his laptop, reviewing the folder Ellen had sent, every damning detail, from Sarah's taunting photo with Brandon, to the log of her office visits Valerie had meticulously kept. Each piece was a brick in the wall he'd built, a testament to the man Sarah had underestimated. He poured a coffee, the steam curling in the quiet, and prepared for the confrontation. Tomorrow Sarah would face the consequences of her contempt, not in a courtroom drama, but in the cold precision of a man who'd spent years preparing for this moment. She'd thought she could erase him, but Thomas was no ghost. He was the architect of her undoing, and he was ready. The mediation room in downtown Des Moines was stark, its long table and stiff chairs a stage for the unraveling of Sarah Coleman's plans. Thomas sat beside Ellen, his posture calm, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting under fluorescent lights. Sarah entered, her designer outfit and perfect makeup a fragile mask for the tension in her eyes. She avoided his gaze, sitting beside her attorney, a slick man named Richard Holt, who opened with a practiced smile. "My client seeks a fair division of assets," Holt said, despite Mr. Harper's aggressive tactics. Thomas's expression didn't shift, but Ellen leaned forward, sliding a folder across the table. "Let's discuss fair," she said, her voice cutting. Sarah forged Thomas's signature on a $175,000 loan, used marital assets without consent, and transferred $118,000 in an act the bank has flagged as fraud. Holt's smile faltered as he skimmed the documents, Sarah's email, the transfer confirmation, Valerie's log, the loan with Thomas's forged signature. Sarah's composure cracked, her voice sharp. "It was our joint account. I'm his wife." Thomas met her eyes, his tone even. "You're the ex-wife who thought I wouldn't notice." She flinched, her bravado crumbling. "You were always just there, Thomas," she snapped, her words laced with the contempt she'd worn for years. "Counting your numbers, never looking up. I deserved better." Her admission hung in the air, proof she'd never seen the man who'd funded her dreams, who'd hoped she'd see him. Inside, Thomas felt a quiet shift, not anger but liberation. She'd defined him as less, but he'd broken free, his worth no longer tied to her gaze. Ellen's voice cut through. "The bank disagrees, Miss Coleman. They're ready to press charges." Sarah's face drained of color, her underestimation of Thomas laid bare in the silence that followed. The room grew heavier as Ellen outlined the stakes. "The district attorney is reviewing the fraud and forgery charges," she said, her eyes on Sarah. "That's prison time, Ms. Coleman, unless we resolve this today." Sarah's hands trembled, her attorney whispering urgently, but she shook her head, voice breaking. "Thomas, you can't do this. I thought you just let me go." Her words were a confession, her belief that he was too weak to fight now a noose around her. Thomas leaned forward, his voice low, unyielding. "You thought I was the man you mocked, the one you called your ATM. You didn't know me, Sarah." The truth landed like a blow. She'd built her escape on a lie, assuming his silence was surrender. Ellen slid a settlement across the table. Sarah would keep her yoga studio, her car, and personal belongings, but no alimony. and she'd assume the debts tied to Brandon's loans. "Sign this," Ellen said, "and Thomas will provide a statement to mitigate the criminal charges. He won't pursue the theft of personal property either." Sarah stared at the papers, her world collapsing under the weight of her misjudgment. "I never thought you'd fight like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You always went along with everything." Thomas's gaze held hers, steady. "That was my choice. This is yours." Her hand shook as she signed, the pen scratched loud in the quiet room. She'd gambled on his passivity, but Thomas had rewritten the rules, and she'd lost everything she'd tried to steal. The fallout came swiftly, a cascade Thomas had set in motion. The bank, armed with Ellen's evidence, called in Brandon Tucker's loans, their foundation, Thomas's marital assets, now void. By week's end, repo trucks arrived at Harmon Fitness, hauling away gleaming equipment as Brandon watched, his tanned face pale with shock. The gym was sold to a national chain, its neon sign dimmed, and Brandon left Des Moines for Miami, his Instagram silent, his brand in tatters. Sarah fled to Colorado, her posts about new beginnings and mountain views a hollow mask for her defeat. Thomas heard the news through Michael, who tracked their movements online. "They're done," Michael said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. Thomas nodded, feeling no triumph, only closure. That afternoon a courier delivered a small box to his condo, no note, no sender's name. Inside was his father's watch, its steel face scratched but intact, the engraving "Keep what matters a quiet victory." Sarah or Brandon had sent it, perhaps a last attempt to appease him, but it didn't matter. The watch was home, a symbol of the promise he'd kept to his father, the one Sarah had mocked as old-fashioned. He held it, his chest tightening, not with anger but with gratitude for the man who'd taught him to endure. She'd thought she could strip him of his past, his worth, but Thomas had guarded what mattered most. He slipped the watch onto his wrist, its weight grounding him, and turned his gaze to the city outside. The trap had closed, not with fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of a man who'd never bent. Thomas stood in his condo, the evening light softening the room's edges, and let the events settle in his mind. He hadn't fought for revenge, but for the truth Sarah had tried to bury. She'd called him boring, predictable. Her laughter a weapon she'd wielded at dinners, parties, moments he'd endured in silence. "Thomas lives for his calculators," she joked, her friends chuckling, none questioning her absence or her new friend Brandon. Her contempt had been her fatal flaw, blinding her to the man who'd funded her dreams, who'd stayed in Des Moines for family, who'd built a fortress she couldn't breach. Now, with her signature on the settlement, the gym gone, and Brandon vanished, Thomas saw her mistake clearly. She'd never known him, never seen the strength in his silence. He walked to the living room, pausing at the wedding photo, the last trace of their life together. He took it down, placing it in a drawer, not with anger, but with finality. Sarah's world had collapsed, not because he'd sought to destroy her, but because she'd underestimated the man she'd tried to erase. He poured a coffee, the ritual a reminder of who he was, a man who'd chosen love, then chosen himself. The city hummed outside, indifferent to his victory, but Thomas felt no need for applause. He'd reclaimed his life, not with shouts, but with the quiet power of a man who'd always known his worth. Sarah's greatest error wasn't her betrayal, it was believing he'd let her define him. He turned off the light, ready for what came next, free in a way she'd never understand. Thomas Harper left the hotel's sterile walls behind, trading them for a small craftsman house near downtown Des Moines. The house was modest, its wood floors creaking and paint peeling, but it felt alive, a project he could shape with his hands. At 54, he found solace in the rhythm of repair, sanding beams, replacing cracked tiles, each task a step toward reclaiming himself. The condo, with its echoes of Sarah Coleman's betrayal, was a memory he'd sold, along with the life she'd tried to steal. One Saturday, he and his brother Michael worked side by side, installing kitchen cabinets, the scent of sawdust filling the air. "Heard anything from Sarah?" Michael asked, tightening a screw. Thomas shook his head, his voice calm. "No, and I don't expect to. She's not my problem anymore." Michael grinned, a rare lightness between them. The cabinets gleamed, a small triumph, proof Thomas could build something new. Sarah had called him boring, her laughter a blade she'd wielded for years, believing he'd never break free. She thought his silence was a cage, his love a leash, but her contempt had been her downfall. Now, as he hammered a nail, the sound echoed like a heartbeat, steady and sure. The house wasn't just a home, it was a declaration that Sarah's judgment no longer defined him. He'd fought not to destroy her but to free himself, and every repaired corner of this house was proof he'd won. Outside, kids laughed in the neighborhood, their voices carrying a simplicity Thomas hadn't felt in years. He wiped sweat from his brow, feeling lighter than he had in decades, a man no longer carrying the weight of someone else's lies. Thomas took a rare 2 weeks off, packing his truck and driving north to the family cabin in Minnesota, a place of pine trees and still waters where he'd once fished with his father. The road stretched open before him, the hum of the engine a quiet companion. At the cabin, he unpacked his fishing gear, the familiar weight of the rod grounding him. Valerie, his assistant, had sent a letter before he left, her words simple but piercing. "You showed me that staying calm is strength, Thomas. Thank you for being who you are." He tucked the letter into his bag, its sincerity a contrast to Sarah's scorn. She'd called him ATM at parties, predictable and private, her voice dripping with disdain for the man who'd funded her dreams. She'd never seen the Thomas who'd stayed in Des Moines for his mother's final years, or who'd quietly paid for a neighbor's kid to attend college. Now, as he cast his line into the lake, the water rippling under a pale sky, he saw her mistake clearly. Sarah hadn't just betrayed him, she'd dismissed him, believing his worth lay only in what he gave her. But Thomas had fought for himself, not with rage, but with the steady resolve of a man who knew his value. The cabin's quiet wrapped around him, the lake reflecting a life he was rebuilding, not for Sarah's approval, but for his own. He reeled in the line, empty but untroubled, and sat on the dock, the past fading like mist. He'd won not by breaking Sarah, but by refusing to let her break him. The sun dipped low over the Minnesota lake, painting the water gold as Thomas Harper sat on the dock, his father's watch glinting on his wrist. The scratches on its steel face told a story of survival, a reminder of the promise etched inside, "Keep what matters." He traced the engraving, his father's voice clear in his memory. "Don't let anyone take what's yours, son," he'd said, his hands rough from years of carpentry, his eyes steady with conviction. Thomas had kept that vow, not just in reclaiming the watch, but in reclaiming himself from Sarah's lies. She'd thought him a shadow, a man too dull to challenge her, her laughter a weapon she'd used to diminish him. "Thomas lives for his calculators," she'd joked, blind to the strength in his silence, the loyalty that anchored him. Now, as the lake shimmered, he saw the full arc of his journey. 15 years of love offered, then betrayed, followed by a fight not for vengeance, but for truth. Sarah's greatest error wasn't her affair or her theft. It was believing she could define him, that her contempt could erase the man who'd built a life on principle. He cast his line again, the motion fluid, and thought of Valerie's letter, Michael's support, the house waiting in Des Moines. They saw the Thomas Sarah never did, the one who'd chosen to love, then chosen to stand. The horizon glowed, a promise of days unburdened by her shadow. He whispered to the lake, to his father, "I kept what matters. No one can define your worth unless you hand them the key. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's how you rewrite the story."